Hello, my dear listeners, and welcome back to another evening of ancient tales and forgotten magic. Tonight, we journey far back through the mists of time to an age when the gods still walked among mortals, when druids tended sacred groves, and when the old ways held power over life and death itself. This is a story of two great peoples, the Celts and the Germanic tribes, and of the ancient bond their gods once shared. So settle in, pull your blankets close, and let us begin. The sacred grove of Innisderwood stood ancient and silent in the gathering twilight. Oak trees older than memory formed a circle around a pool of still water, their gnarled branches reaching toward the darkening sky like the fingers of sleeping giants. Moss covered every stone. Ivy climbed every trunk. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke and something else, something that spoke of magic as old as the hills themselves. Cormac knelt beside the pool, his hands stained with the herbs he had been grinding since midday. He was a young man of 28 summers, with dark hair that fell past his shoulders and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore the simple brown robes of a druid, belted at the waist with a cord of braided leather. Around his neck hung a silver torque, the mark of his station, though he had never felt worthy of wearing it. Behind him, in a small shelter of woven branches, his mentor lay dying. Elder Brenius had been old when Cormac first came to him as a boy of 12, and now the years had finally caught up with the ancient druid. His breathing came shallow and rattling like wind through dead leaves. His skin had taken on the pallor of birch bark, and his eyes, once bright with wisdom, had grown cloudy and distant. Cormac rose from the pool's edge and carried a clay cup of herbed water back to the shelter. He knelt beside his mentor and lifted the old man's head gently, pressing the cup to his cracked lips. "Drink, master. It will ease the passage." Brenius took a small sip, then turned his head away. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "The herbs cannot help me now, boy. My thread is nearly spun out. The Morrigan waits for me. I can hear her wings." Cormac set the cup aside and took the old man's hand in his own. The skin felt papery thin, the bones beneath as fragile as dry twigs. "You cannot leave yet, master. There is still so much I need to learn." A dry chuckle escaped Brenius, though it cost him dearly. The coughing that followed left him gasping. "You have learned enough. More than enough. The knowledge lives in you now, Cormac. It pulses in your blood. The oak and the ash, the mistletoe and the hazel, the names of the old gods and the words of power. All of it." He gripped Cormac's hand with surprising strength. "But there is one more thing I must tell you. One last secret that has been passed from druid to druid since the age of heroes." Cormac leaned closer, his heart pounding. In the lands far to the north, Brenius continued, his voice growing distant as if he were already walking between worlds. "There is a grove, not like this one, but greater. A place where our gods once met with the gods of the northern peoples, the ones who worship Woden and Thunor and Tiw. It was called the Grove of Council, and there the divine powers of two great peoples made alliance against the darkness." Cormac had heard whispers of such things in the old songs, hints and fragments that spoke of a time when all the gods had stood together. but he had always thought them mere legend. The Alliance Master. What became of it? Brenius's eyes focused suddenly, meeting Cormac's with an intensity that made the younger man's breath catch. It faded, as the peoples drifted apart, as new religions came from the east with their single god. The old alliance was forgotten. The grove fell into shadow. The meeting place of gods became a place of emptiness. He paused, struggling for breath, but the grove still stands, and something evil stirs there now. Something that feeds on forgetting. I have seen it in my visions, felt it in my bones. If the grove falls completely, if the last memory of the Alliance is extinguished, then the old gods themselves will fade. All of them. Celtic and Germanic alike. But what can I do? Cormac asked, his voice thick with emotion. I am just one druid in a world that has little need of druids anymore. Brenius reached beneath his blanket and drew forth something that gleamed in the fading light. It was a staff, carved from oak heartwood and polished by centuries of handling. Spirals and knotwork covered its surface, interlacing patterns that seemed to shift and change when Cormac looked at them directly. This staff was old when my teacher's teacher was young, Brenius said. It has passed from hand to hand since the time when our people first came to these isles. It carries the blessing of the Dagda himself. Take it, Cormac. Take it and go north. Find the Grove of Council. Rekindle the old alliance before it is too late. Cormac's hands trembled as he accepted the staff. It was heavier than it looked, and warm to the touch, as if a fire burned deep within the wood. How will I find this grove? He asked. The northern lands are vast, and I do not speak the tongue of the Germanic peoples. The staff will guide you. Brenius's voice was fading now, growing thin as morning mist. And you will find allies along the way. Trust in the old gods. Trust in the power that flows through your veins. And trust, he paused, his eyes flickering toward the darkening sky beyond the shelter. Trust in the crows. As if summoned by his words, a harsh cry split the air. Cormac looked up to see a crow descending into the grove, its wings black as midnight against the purple sky. It landed on a low branch near the pool and regarded him with one bright eye. The Morrigan, Brenius breathed. She comes. The crow cried out again, and Cormac felt something shift in the air around him. The temperature dropped, the shadows deepened, and then impossibly, the surface of the sacred pool began to glow with a pale silver light. Go to the pool, boy, Brenius commanded, his voice suddenly strong. See what she would show you. Cormac rose on unsteady legs and approached the pool. The crow watched him pass, but made no move, its dark eye gleaming with intelligence that was anything but natural. When Cormac reached the water's edge, he looked down into its glowing depths. What he saw made his blood run cold. The pool showed him a vision of a grove, but not the gentle sanctuary of Anistevid. This grove was vast and ancient, its trees towering into a sky that burned with stars. At its center stood a great altar of gray stone, carved with symbols from both Celtic and Germanic traditions. Around it, the shadowy forms of gods had once gathered, figures of terrible beauty and power. But the vision shifted, and Cormac saw the grove as it was now. The great trees stood withered and gray, their leaves fallen and rotting on the ground. The altar was cracked and stained with something dark, and all around, pressing in from every direction, was a blackness that moved and pulsed like a living thing. It was not merely darkness, Cormac realized with horror. It was absence, emptiness, the void that exists where memory has been erased. And at the heart of that void something waited, something hungry. The vision faded, and Cormac stumbled back from the pool, gasping. The crow cried out once more, and when he looked at it, he could have sworn he saw the face of a woman in its eyes, a woman with hair like black feathers and lips the color of blood. Then the crow spread its wings and flew up into the night, vanishing among the stars. Cormac turned and hurried back to the shelter. But even before he reached it, he knew. He could feel the absence, the sudden stillness in the air. Elder Brenius lay with his eyes closed, a peaceful expression on his lined face. His chest no longer rose and fell. His hands lay folded over his heart, and somehow, in the moment of his passing, he had managed to arrange himself with dignity. Cormac knelt beside his mentor one last time. Tears streamed down his face, but he made no sound. Druids did not weep loudly for the dead. Death was merely a doorway, a passage from one realm to the next. Brenius would feast now in the halls of the ancestors, would walk in the other world where summer never ended and sorrow never came. But knowing this did not ease the ache in Cormac's chest. He sat with the body through the long hours of the night, keeping vigil as tradition demanded. He sang the old songs in a voice that cracked with grief. He burned sacred herbs and spoke the words of passage. And as the first gray light of dawn crept over the eastern hills, he wrapped his mentor's body in a cloak of white linen and prepared it for the funeral rites. The villagers came at mid-morning, simple folk who had relied on Brenius for healing and wisdom for longer than most could remember. They helped Cormac build the funeral pyre on the hilltop above the grove. They brought offerings of grain and honey and the first fruits of the autumn harvest. And when the pyre was ready, they stood in silent respect as Cormac spoke the final words and touched a burning branch to the oil-soaked wood. The flames rose quickly, consuming the body of the last elder of Innis Derwyd. Cormac watched until there was nothing left but ash and embers, and the lingering smell of smoke. Then he gathered a handful of the ashes in a small leather pouch and hung it around his neck beside the silver torque. "You will come with me, master," he whispered. "You will see the grove restored." That evening, as the villagers returned to their homes and their ordinary lives, Cormac stood alone in the sacred grove. The staff of the Dagda rested in his hand, warm and patient. The crow had returned at some point during the day, and now sat watching him from the same branch as before. Cormac looked at it and nodded slowly. "Very well," he said. "I understand. I will go north." The crow cawed once and flew away to the northeast as if showing him the direction. Cormac took a deep breath and looked around the grove one last time. This had been his home for 16 years, the only place where he had ever truly belonged. Leaving it felt like cutting away a part of his own soul. But some things were more important than comfort. Some callings could not be refused. He shouldered his pack, gripped the staff, and walked out of the sacred grove into the uncertain night. Behind him, The pool glowed faintly silver, and the oaks whispered ancient blessings in the wind. The journey had begun. Tao, the journey to the coast, took Cormac 7 days of hard walking. He followed ancient paths through forests and over hills, past standing stones that hummed with faded power, and through villages where people still left offerings at crossroads for spirits they no longer truly believed in. The staff of the Dagda guided him as Brenius had promised, growing warm when he walked in the right direction, and cool when he strayed from the path. At night, he slept beneath the stars or in the sheltered hollows of great trees. He ate sparingly from his pack of dried meat and hard bread, supplementing his meals with berries and roots he recognized from his training. Once he came upon a stream where silver fish leaped in the moonlight, and he caught 2 with his bare hands, cooking them over a small fire and giving thanks to the spirits of the water for their gift. The crow followed him, not constantly, but often enough that Cormac came to expect its presence. It would appear at dawn, circling overhead or perch on a branch near his evening camp, watching with those knowing eyes. He began speaking to it as he walked, sharing his thoughts and fears as he might have shared them with Brenius. The crow never answered, of course, but somehow its presence made the loneliness more bearable. On the morning of the 8th day, Cormac crested a rise and saw the sea. It stretched before him like hammered silver, vast and grey beneath a sky heavy with clouds. The smell of salt and seaweed reached him even at this distance, carried on a wind that cut through his robes with icy fingers. Along the shore, a small port town clustered around a natural harbour, its wooden buildings weathered by years of spray and storm. Cormac made his way down to the town, which the locals called Portus Dubri. It was a busy place, filled with merchants and sailors from a dozen different lands. He heard languages he did not recognize, saw goods from places he had only heard of in stories. The docks were crowded with vessels of every size, from small fishing boats to great trading ships with sails furled against their masts. He spent the better part of the morning asking about passage to the Germanic lands. Most captains refused outright. The crossing was dangerous this time of year, they said. The autumn storms were unpredictable. And besides, what business did a druid have in the lands of the Northmen? Cormac was beginning to lose hope when he heard a woman's voice behind him. "You seek passage across the grey water, do you?" He turned to find a woman watching him with curious eyes. She was perhaps 30 years old, with hair the color of ripe wheat braided in a style he did not recognize. She wore practical traveling clothes of wool and leather, and a sword hung at her hip with the easy familiarity of long use. Her accent was strange, the words of his language shaped by a tongue accustomed to different sounds. "I do," Cormac replied. "I must reach the lands of the Germanic peoples. It is a matter of great importance." The woman studied him for a long moment, her gaze taking in his druid's robes, his staff, the silver torque around his neck. "I am Sigrid," she said finally, "a trader. I have a ship that leaves with the morning tide, bound for my homeland. I could use another hand on the crossing, and you look strong enough despite your priestly appearance. Can you work a rope?" "I can learn," Sigrid smiled, showing teeth that were white and even. Good answer. The passage will cost you nothing if you work. If you prefer to travel as cargo, the price is 10 silver pieces, your choice. I will work, Cormac said without hesitation. His coin purse was nearly empty, and he had a feeling he would need what little remained. Sigrid nodded approvingly. Be at the 3rd pier before dawn. My ship is called the Grey Gull. Do not be late. The tide waits for no one, not even druids. She turned and walked away into the crowd before Cormac could thank her properly. He watched her go, wondering at his fortune, the Morrigan's hand perhaps, or simply the kindness of strangers. Either way, he was grateful. He spent his last few coins on a bed at a dockside inn and a meal of fish stew that warmed him to his bones. That night he dreamed of the grove again, of the darkness pressing in from all sides, and of voices calling out in languages he almost understood. The Grey Gull was a sturdy vessel, wide in the beam and low in the water, built for cargo rather than speed. Cormac found it in the grey light before dawn, its crew already busy with preparations for departure. Sigrid stood at the steering oar, calling out orders in her native tongue. When she saw Cormac approaching, she switched to his language. Good. You came. Stow your things below and report to Thorvald. She pointed to an old sailor with a grey beard and weathered skin like cracked leather. He will show you your duties. Thorvald regarded Cormac with eyes that had seen more horizons than most men could imagine. His hands were gnarled and rope-burned, his back bent from years of labor, but there was a sharpness to his gaze that spoke of a keen mind behind the aged exterior. A druid, eh? He spat over the side of the ship. Never had one of your kind aboard before. Can you swim? Poorly, Cormac admitted. Thorvald laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. Then stay out of the water. Come, I will teach you how to be useful. The old sailor was a patient teacher despite his gruff manner. He showed Cormac how to coil ropes, how to secure cargo, how to read the wind by watching the surface of the water. The work was hard and unfamiliar, and by the time the Grey Gull cleared the harbor, Cormac's hands were already raw and blistered. But there was something freeing about the physical labor, something that kept his mind from dwelling on the task ahead. He threw himself into the work with a will, and if the other sailors regarded him with suspicion at first, they gradually came to accept his presence among them. The first day passed without incident. The sea was calm, the wind steady, and the Grey Gull made good progress towards northeast. Cormac stood at the rail as the sun set, watching the last glimpse of his homeland sink below the horizon. He felt a pang of loss, sharp and sudden, and touched the pouch of ashes that hung around his neck. I am doing as you asked, master, he whispered. I hope I am worthy of your trust. That night, Thorvald found him sitting alone on a coil of rope, staring up at the stars. Cannot sleep, the old sailor asked, settling down beside him with a grunt. The ship moves too much. I am not accustomed to it. Thorvald chuckled. You will find your sea legs soon enough. Or you will not, and you will be miserable until we reach land again. He produced a small flask from his coat and took a long drink before offering it to Cormac. Mead. Good for what troubles you. Cormac accepted the flask and took a careful sip. The mead was sweet and strong, warming his belly. "You have sailed these waters many times?" he asked. "More times than I can count." Thorvald's eyes grew distant. "I was born on a ship, or so my mother claimed. The sea is in my blood as magic is in yours." "How did you know?" Thorvald tapped the side of his nose. "I can smell it on you. Power, the old kind from the earth and the sky. We have wise women in my homeland who carry the same scent, the vulvas we call them. They speak to the gods and read the threads of fate." "Your gods," Cormac said carefully, "they are different from ours?" Thorvald considered this for a moment. "Different names, different stories. But I have lived long enough to wonder if perhaps they are not so different after all." He pointed up at the stars. "You see that bright one there? We call it the Eye of Woden, the All-Father, the Wanderer, the Seeker of Wisdom. They say he gave his own eye to drink from the well of knowledge." Cormac nodded slowly. "We have a god called the Dagda. He carries a great club that can kill 9 men with one end and bring them back to life with the other. And he possesses a cauldron that never empties, that can feed an army and still have food to spare." "A club and a cauldron." Thorvald smiled. "Woden has a spear that never misses its mark, and 2 ravens that fly across the world and whisper secrets in his ear. Different gifts, perhaps, but both are gods of wisdom, are they not? Both seek to understand the mysteries of the world." Something stirred in Cormac's chest. A recognition, a sense of connection he had not expected to find. "Tell me more," he said. "Tell me of your gods." And so, as the grey gull sailed through the star-filled night, Thorvald spoke of Woden the All-Father, who hung upon the world tree for 9 days and nights to gain the secret of the runes. He spoke of Thunor, the Thunderer, who wielded a hammer of lightning and protected mankind from the giants. He spoke of Freya the Beautiful, goddess of love and war, who rode a chariot pulled by cats and wore a cloak of falcon feathers. And he spoke of Tu, the one-handed god of justice and courage, who sacrificed his sword hand to bind the great wolf Fenrir. Cormac listened with growing wonder. The names were different, as Thorvald had said, but beneath the names he could feel something familiar. The same forces, perhaps, wearing different masks for different peoples. The second day brought clouds and choppy water, but still nothing the grey gull could not handle. Cormac worked alongside the sailors, his hands growing calloused and his movements more sure. Sigrid acknowledged his efforts with a nod, which Thorvald assured him was high praise indeed. But on the 3rd day everything changed. The storm came from the west, boiling up out of nowhere with a speed that caught even the experienced sailors off guard. One moment, the sky was merely overcast. The next, it had turned the color of a bruise, and the wind was screaming through the rigging like a chorus of tormented souls. "All hands!" Sigrid bellowed over the roar of the gale. "Secure the cargo, reef the sail." The crew scrambled to obey, fighting against waves that crashed over the deck and threatened to sweep men into the hungry sea. Cormac clung to a rope with one hand while trying to help secure a loose barrel with the other. Salt water stung his eyes. The cold bit through his soaked robes like knives of ice. And then, through the chaos, he saw something that made his blood freeze. Faces in the waves, pale, gleaming faces with eyes like empty pools and mouths that gaped in soundless hunger. The spirits of the drowned, reaching up from the depths, drawn by the promise of fresh souls to join their eternal wandering. "Sea wraiths!" Thorvald cried, his voice cracking with fear. "The storm has woken the sea wraiths." Cormac acted on instinct. He raised his staff and began to chant, words of power that Brenius had taught him long ago, words that called upon the old agreements between land and sea, between the living and the dead. The staff blazed with golden light, cutting through the grey murk of the storm. The sea wraiths recoiled, their faces twisting in anger and pain. Cormac pushed harder, pouring his will into the words, feeling the power flow through him like a river of fire. The waves around the ship began to calm. Not completely, not all at once, but enough. The screaming wind dropped to a manageable roar. The faces in the water faded, sinking back into the depths from which they had risen. Cormac lowered his staff, gasping for breath. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed against the mast, utterly spent. When he opened his eyes again, the storm had passed. The grey gull rocked gently on waters that sparkled under a clearing sky. The crew stood in a circle around him, staring with expressions that mixed fear and awe. Sigrid pushed through them and knelt beside him. "That was magic," she said. Her voice was flat, unreadable. "Real magic." "Yes," Cormac managed. "You saved my ship, my crew." She studied him for a long moment, then reached out and gripped his forearm in the manner of warriors. "You have my thanks, druid, and my respect." Behind her, Thorvald was grinning. "I told you," he said to no one in particular. "I told you I could smell the power on him." The remaining days of the voyage passed peacefully. The sailors no longer looked at Cormac with suspicion. Instead, they treated him with a cautious respect, as one might treat a wild animal that had proven itself friendly. They shared their food with him, their stories, their songs, and Cormac found himself feeling for the first time since leaving the grove that he was not entirely alone. On the morning of the 6th day, Sigrid called out from her position at the steering oar. "Land ahead!" Cormac rushed to the bow and looked out across the grey water. There, rising from the sea like the backs of sleeping giants, were the shores of the Germanic lands. Dark forests crowned the cliffs. Smoke rose from unseen villages, and somewhere beyond those trees, the grove of council waited. The journey was far from over, but one part of it, at least, was complete. "Welcome to my homeland, druid," Sigrid said, coming to stand beside him. "May you find whatever you seek." Cormac gripped his staff and nodded. "Me we both," he replied. The grey gull made port at a small harbour, nestled between two rocky headlands. A village sprawled up the hillside beyond. Timber buildings with thatched roofs clustered around a central hall that dominated the settlement like a sleeping dragon. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, carrying the scent of cooking meat and burning pine. Sigrid guided her ship to the dock with practiced ease, calling out greetings in her native tongue to the men who waited to catch the mooring ropes. The language sounded harsh to Cormac's ears, full of hard consonants and rolling sounds, but he tried to commit what words he could to memory. He would need to learn this tongue if he was to survive in these lands. "This is Wolf's Haven," Sigrid told him as the crew began unloading cargo. "The seat of the Wolf clan, my people. You may rest here before continuing your journey, though I cannot promise you will be welcomed." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "My people are suspicious of strangers, and doubly suspicious of magic workers. The wise women are accepted because they are our own. You are something different." Cormac nodded, understanding. "I thank you for the warning. And for the passage, I am in your debt." Sigrid shook her head. "You saved my ship and my crew. Any debt between us is settled, but I will speak to the chieftain on your behalf. Beyond that, your fate is in your own hands." The dock was crowded with activity as the traders of Wolf's Haven came to examine the Grey Gull's cargo. Cormac gathered his belongings and followed Sigrid through the throng, feeling the weight of curious stares upon him. His brown robes marked him as foreign, and his staff drew more than a few wary glances. The village itself was larger than Cormac had expected. Several hundred people lived here, he guessed, in homes that ranged from simple huts to substantial longhouses. The streets, if they could be called that, were muddy from recent rain, and pigs and chickens wandered freely between the buildings. Children stopped their games to stare as the stranger passed. Women paused in their work, hands going still on spindles and looms. The central hall was an impressive structure, its roof ridge adorned with carved wooden figures that Cormac recognized as wolves. Their jaws gaped open, teeth bared in eternal snarls. Shields hung along the outer walls, painted with various designs that he assumed represented family lineages or battle honors. Sigrid led him through the great doors into a space that was dim and warm, lit by a fire burning in a long central hearth. The smoke rose to escape through vents in the roof, but enough lingered to give the air a hazy quality. Weapons hung on the walls, swords and axes and spears. Hunting trophies stared down from mounted positions. The heads of boars and stags and one enormous bear. At the far end of the hall, seated on a raised platform, was a man who could only be the chieftain. He was perhaps 50 years old, with iron-grey hair pulled back from a face that was all hard angles and weathered skin. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, white against his tanned complexion. He wore a coat of wolf fur over a tunic of dark wool, and a silver arm ring glinted in the firelight. His eyes were the pale blue of winter ice, and they fixed on Cormac with an intensity that made the druid want to look away. But he did not. He met the chieftain's gaze and held it. Sigrid spoke rapidly in her own language, gesturing occasionally towards Cormac. The chieftain listened without expression, his fingers drumming slowly on the arm of his chair. When Sigrid finished, he spoke, his voice a deep rumble like distant thunder. "He asks why a Celtic priest comes to our lands," Sigrid translated. "He asks what business you have with the Wolf clan." Cormac considered his answer carefully. He could not reveal everything, not yet, but he needed to say enough to gain their trust. "I am a druid," he said, and waited for Sigrid to translate. I serve the old gods of my people, as your wise women serve yours. I have come north because I have been given a vision, a warning of a danger that threatens both our peoples. I seek only passage through your lands and whatever guidance you might offer. I mean no harm to the wolf clan or any who dwell here. The chieftain listened, his expression unreadable. When Sigrid finished translating, he spoke again. He says his name is Wulfric, Sigrid told Cormac. He has been chieftain of the wolf clan for 20 winters. He has fought Romans and rival clans and the creatures of the dark forest. He does not fear foreign priests or their visions. She paused, a slight smile tugging at her lips. But he is willing to hear more, if you can prove you are more than words. Before Cormac could respond, a voice rang out from the shadows at the edge of the hall. Father, we should not trust this outlander. A young man stepped into the firelight. He was perhaps 25, tall and broad-shouldered, with the same pale eyes as the chieftain. His hair was the color of dark honey, worn long and tied back with a leather cord. He carried himself like a warrior, balanced on the balls of his feet, one hand resting casually on the hilt of the sword at his hip. Eorl, Sigrid said, and there was a note of warning in her voice. The chieftain's son, hot-headed and suspicious of anything that does not fit his understanding of the world. Eorl strode forward until he stood directly before Cormac, close enough that the druid could smell the leather of his armor and the metal of his blade. I know of your kind, Eorl said, his words accented but understandable. You Celtic priests with your strange rituals and your tree worship. Our ancestors drove your people from these lands generations ago. Why should we welcome you back now? Cormac kept his voice calm. I do not come as a conqueror or an invader. I am one man alone, seeking to preserve something that belongs to both our peoples. And what is that? Eorl demanded. The old alliance, Cormac said. The bond that once existed between your gods and mine. A bond that is now threatened by a darkness that cares nothing for the boundaries between peoples. Eorl laughed, but there was no humor in it. The old alliance is a children's tale, a story wise women tell to explain why there are standing stones in the forest. He turned to address his father. Send this foreigner away, father. He brings nothing but trouble. But before Wulfric could respond, another voice spoke. Perhaps we should not be so quick to judge. An old woman emerged from a doorway at the side of the hall. She moved slowly, leaning on a staff carved with runes, but her eyes were bright and sharp despite her age. She wore a dress of dark blue wool, and a collection of charms and amulets hung from her belt. Her white hair was braided with feathers and bits of bone. Hilda, Sigrid murmured to Cormac, the village wise woman, a Volva of great power. If she speaks in your favor, Wulfric will listen. Hilda approached Cormac with the measured pace of one who has long since stopped hurrying for anyone. She circled him slowly, examining him from every angle, her nostrils flaring as if she were scenting him like a hunting hound. He carries the old power, she said finally, her words translated by Sigrid. I can feel it in him like heat from a banked fire, and his staff. She reached out and touched the wood with one gnarled finger. This wood remembers the time before time. It has been blessed by powers that even we have forgotten." She turned to face Wulfric. "This man speaks truth, chieftain. I have dreamed of his coming for many moons. The spirits whispered that a stranger would arrive from across the water, bearing the mark of the old ways. They said he would seek the sacred grove, the place where our ancestors met with the ancestors of his people." She paused, her voice dropping. "And they said that if he fails, the darkness will consume us all." Silence fell over the hall. Earl's hand had tightened on his sword hilt, but he did not draw. Wulfric sat motionless, his pale eyes moving from Hilda to Cormac and back again. Finally, the chieftain spoke. "He will stay," Sigrid translated, "but he must prove himself worthy of our trust. He must show that his magic is real, that his intentions are true. If he fails this test, he will be cast out into the forest to find his own way." Cormac bowed his head. "I accept the chieftain's terms." The test came sooner than he expected. As evening fell over Wolf's Haven, word spread through the village that a sick child had taken a turn for the worse. The daughter of a woodcutter and his wife, a girl of perhaps 7 winters, had been ill for nearly a week with a fever that would not break. The village healers had done what they could, but their remedies seemed only to delay the inevitable. Hilda found Cormac at the small guest house where he had been given a place to sleep. "Come," she said, needing no translator now that they were alone. Her grasp of his language was better than she had let on. "There is a child who needs healing. Show me what your Celtic magic can do." Cormac followed her through the darkening streets to a small house near the edge of the village. Inside, a man and woman knelt beside a low bed where a tiny figure lay beneath a pile of furs. The girl's face was flushed with fever, her breathing shallow and rapid. Her eyes were closed, and she moaned softly in her sleep. The parents looked up as Hilda and Cormac entered. The woman's face was streaked with tears, and the man's jaw was set in the grim expression of one who expects the worst. Hilda spoke to them in their language, her tone gentle. The woman looked at Cormac with desperate hope. The man's expression was harder to read. "They have agreed to let you try," Hilda said to Cormac, "but know that, if the child dies, they will blame you. And so will the rest of the village." Cormac nodded and knelt beside the bed. He placed one hand on the girl's forehead, feeling the heat that radiated from her skin. The fever was severe, but beneath it, he could sense something else, a wrongness, a taint that spoke of more than simple illness. "This is not natural sickness," he said softly. "Something has touched this child, something from outside." Hilda's eyes narrowed. "I suspected as much. The darkness you spoke of, it reaches even here." Cormac closed his eyes and began to chant. The words were ancient, taught to him by Brennius in the first years of his training. They called upon the healing power of the earth itself, upon the green growing force that lived in every plant and tree and blade of grass. He felt that power answer, flowing up through the floor, through his knees and his hands into the body of the sick child. The girl gasped, and her eyes flew open, but Cormac was already elsewhere. his spirit traveling the paths between worlds. He followed the thread of wrongness to its source and found what he had feared. A shadow, small but persistent, had attached itself to the child's essence. It was feeding on her life force, growing stronger as she grew weaker. He confronted the shadow with the light of his own spirit. It recoiled, hissing, in a voice that was more sensation than sound. For a moment, they struggled, druid and darkness, while the girl's life hung in the balance. Then Cormac reached deeper than he had ever reached before. He found the core of his power, the place where his soul touched the infinite, and he drew upon that connection with everything he had. The shadow shrieked and fled, dissipating like morning mist before the sun. Cormac opened his eyes to find himself lying on the floor of the small house, his body drenched in sweat. Hilda was bending over him, her face showing something very close to wonder. "The child," he gasped. "See for yourself." Cormac turned his head. The girl was sitting up in her bed, her color already returning to normal. She looked at him with clear, curious eyes and smiled. The mother let out a cry of joy and gathered her daughter in her arms. The father stood frozen for a moment, then crossed the room and knelt before Cormac. He gripped the druid's hand and spoke words that Cormac did not understand, but the meaning was clear enough. Gratitude, deep, heartfelt gratitude. Hilda helped Cormac to his feet. "You have proven yourself," she said. "Word of this will spread quickly. By morning the whole village will know what you did." She paused, studying him with those bright, knowing eyes. "You truly believe the darkness is coming, do you not?" "I have seen it," Cormac replied. "In visions and in dreams. It is already here, in small ways. That shadow on the child was just a taste of what waits in the grove." Hilda nodded slowly. "Then we must prepare," she said, "and I will help you in whatever way I can." They walked back through the village together, the wise woman and the druid, two servants of the old ways united by a common purpose. Above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, and the wind carried whispers of things yet to come. At the edge of the village, a figure stood watching them pass. Owl, the chieftain's son, his face unreadable in the darkness. He said nothing, but when Cormac met his gaze, something had changed. The open hostility was gone, replaced by something more complex. Not quite respect, not yet, but the beginning of curiosity. It was a start. 3 days passed in Wolf's Haven, and Cormac used them well. He spent his mornings with Hilda, learning what he could of Germanic magical traditions. The differences from his own training were many, but beneath those differences he found common ground. Both peoples drew power from the natural world. Both honored their ancestors and sought wisdom from the spirits. Both understood that the boundary between the seen and unseen was thinner than most people wished to believe. Hilda taught him words in her language, simple phrases that would help him communicate without a translator. He learned to say water and bread and thank you and danger. He learned the names of their gods and the proper forms of respect. And he learned that the vulva, like the druids, were a dying breed in a world that was slowly forgetting the old ways. The afternoons he spent exploring the village and its surroundings. The people had warmed to him after the healing of the woodcutter's daughter. They no longer stared with suspicion, but nodded in greeting when he passed. Some even invited him to share their meals, offering bread and cheese and ale with shy smiles and halting attempts at his language. But he all remained distant. The chieftain's son watched Cormac from afar, always present but never approaching. There was a tension in him, a coiled energy that reminded Cormac of a hawk waiting to strike. Something would have to be done about all eventually. The young warrior's distrust could become a problem if left to fester. The opportunity came on the morning of the 4th day. Cormac was breaking his fast in the small guest house when Eorl appeared in the doorway. The young man's face was set in hard lines, his pale eyes glittering with challenge. "You have impressed the old woman and the simple folk," Eorl said in careful accented speech. "But I am not so easily convinced. Anyone can perform tricks. Anyone can speak pretty words about ancient alliances and coming darkness." Cormac set down his bread and met Eorl's gaze steadily. "What would convince you?" "There is a place in the forest," Eorl said. "A ring of standing stones, old beyond memory. The elders say it is sacred to the spirits, that those who spend a night among the stones are tested by the powers that dwell there." He paused, his jaw tightening. "My grandfather entered that circle when he was young, seeking a vision to guide his path. He emerged 3 days later, white-haired and wild-eyed, but he had been granted the sight. He could see the truth in men's hearts until the day he died." Cormac felt a chill run down his spine. He knew of such places. Stone circles existed in his homeland too, remnants of an age before his people had come to those shores. They were places of power, yes, but also places of danger. The spirits that dwelt within them did not suffer fools gladly. "You want me to spend a night among the stones," Cormac said. "It was not a question. I want to know if you are what you claim to be." Eorl replied, "A holy man of the old ways, touched by the gods themselves, or just another wandering fraud seeking shelter and food." He crossed his arms over his chest. "Will you accept the test?" Cormac considered. He could refuse, of course. Hilda had already accepted him, and through her much of the village. But Eorl's doubt would remain, a splinter under the skin of their fragile alliance. And beyond that, Cormac felt the call of the stones themselves. They were kin to the monuments of his homeland, part of the same ancient network of sacred sites that had once connected all the peoples of the old world. "I will go," he said. Something flickered in Eorl's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or a grudging hint of respect. "Then gather your things," Eorl said. "I will take you there myself." They set out within the hour. Hilda tried to object, warning Cormac of the dangers, but he assured her that this was necessary. She pressed a small charm into his hand, a bit of bone carved with protective runes, and made him promise to return safely. The path into the forest was narrow and overgrown, clearly seldom traveled. Eorl led the way in silence, his long legs eating up the distance with the ease of one who had walked these woods since childhood. Cormac followed, his staff tapping against roots and stones, his eyes alert for any sign of the unnatural. The forest itself was ancient, oaks and ashes and elms grew so thick that their branches formed a canopy high overhead, blocking out all but scattered fragments of sky. Moss carpeted the ground and climbed the trunks in thick green blankets. The air smelled of earth and decay and growing things. After perhaps 2 hours of walking, they came to a clearing. Cormac stopped at the edge and stared. The standing stones rose from the earth like the fingers of buried giants. There were 9 of them, arranged in a rough circle perhaps 30 paces across. Each stone stood twice the height of a man, their surfaces weathered smooth by countless centuries of wind and rain. Strange symbols had been carved into them long ago, spirals and lines and shapes that seemed to shift when Cormac looked at them directly. The similarity to the monuments of his homeland was unmistakable. The same unknown builders had raised these stones, part of a civilization that had flourished and fallen before either Celts or Germanic peoples had come to these lands. "This is the place," Jarl said, his voice dropping to something close to a whisper. "The Circle of the Watchers. You will enter before sunset and remain until dawn. If you survive the night, I will accept that you are truly what you claim. If not," he shrugged, "the spirits will have their answer." Cormac nodded slowly. "And you? Where will you be?" "I will wait at the edge of the clearing." All gestured to a large oak at the boundary of the circle. "No one may enter once the test has begun, but I will stand witness." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its edge. "The spirits can be cruel, druid. My grandfather was never the same after his night among the stones. Some who enter do not return at all. You can still refuse." "I cannot," Cormac replied. "Not because of you or your challenge, but because I feel the call of this place. It is connected to something I must understand." Jarl studied him for a long moment, then nodded "As you will." The sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon. Cormac ate a small meal from his pack, drank from his water skin, and made what preparations he could. He placed Hilda's protective charm around his neck, alongside the pouch of Brennius's ashes and the silver torque of his order. He checked that his staff was secure in his grip. Then, as the last rays of sunlight painted the standing stones gold and amber, he walked into the circle. The change was immediate and profound. The sounds of the forest, the birdsong and wind and rustling leaves fell away to nothing. The temperature dropped sharply, and Cormac's breath misted before his face. The light itself seemed different inside the circle, grey and flat, as if the sun's warmth could not penetrate whatever barrier surrounded this place. The stones watched him. He could feel their attention, ancient and patient, weighing him as one might weigh a coin to test its worth. Cormac walked to the center of the circle and sat down cross-legged on the cold earth. He laid his staff across his knees and closed his eyes. "I come in peace," he said aloud, speaking both in his own tongue and the few words of Germanic that he knew. "I am a servant of the old ways, a keeper of ancient knowledge. I seek passage through your domain and wisdom to guide my journey." Silence answered him, but within that silence he could feel something stirring. Night fell quickly, as if the darkness had been waiting just beyond the edge of the world. When Cormac opened his eyes, the clearing was lit only by starlight and the faint glow that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. The sky overhead blazed with more stars than he had ever seen, a river of light flowing across the heavens. The spirits came with the darkness. They emerged from the stones themselves, figures of grey mist and shifting shadow. Some were human in shape, or nearly so. Others were something older, with too many eyes or limbs that bent at wrong angles. They circled around Cormac, their movements soundless, their attention fixed upon him with terrible intensity. "Who comes to our circle?" a voice asked, though no lips moved. It was a sound that existed inside his mind rather than in the air. "I am Cormac, son of Bran, druid of the sacred grove of Innis Derwyd," Cormac replied, his voice steady despite the fear that coiled in his belly. "I walk the path of the old alliance, seeking the grove of council where the gods once met." The spirits conferred among themselves in a language that was not language, a rushing of thoughts and impressions that Cormac could feel but not quite grasp. Then another voice spoke, older and deeper than the first. "The Alliance. We remember. We who were here before the Alliance was made, before the peoples who made it had come to these lands. We watched them raise their stones and speak their prayers. We watched them forget. The Grove of Council," Cormac pressed. "Do you know of it?" "We know of it," the voice confirmed. "It lies to the north and east in the heart of the oldest forest, but it is dying. The darkness that men call forgetfulness has taken root there. Soon there will be nothing left but empty trees and cold stone." "I mean to stop that," Cormac said. "I mean to restore the Alliance and drive back the darkness." Laughter rippled through the assembly of spirits, but it was not cruel. More like the indulgent amusement of elders watching a child attempt something beyond its ability. "You are bold, little druid," another voice said. "Bold or foolish? Perhaps both. But boldness alone will not save the grove. You will need more than Celtic magic. You will need to understand the ways of the northern peoples as well, to bridge the gap that has grown between your traditions." "That is why I came here," Cormac replied. "To learn, to understand, to prove myself worthy of the task." The spirits fell silent again. The air grew colder still, and Cormac felt pressure building around him, a weight of scrutiny that threatened to crush him into the earth. Then something changed. The mist parted, and a figure strode into the circle. He was tall, taller than any mortal man, with a face that was both beautiful and terrible. He wore armor of burnished bronze, and his right arm ended at the wrist in a stump where his hand should have been. Cormac knew who he was. Thorvald had described him. Tiuoyu, the one-handed, god of justice and courage, patron of warriors who kept their oaths. The god stopped before Cormac and looked down at him with eyes that held the light of distant stars. "You seek to restore what was broken," Tiu said. His voice was like the clash of swords, like the cry of eagles, like the first thunder of spring. "A worthy goal, but worthiness must be proven, not claimed." "I am prepared," Cormac replied. Tiu smiled, and it was not a reassuring expression. "We shall see." The test that followed was not of the body, but of the spirit. Tiu showed Cormac visions, memories of his own life reflected back at him through a lens of absolute truth. every failure, every moment of doubt, every time he had fallen short of his ideals. The death of his parents when he was young, the years of loneliness before Brennius found him, the countless small betrayals of self that every person commits in the course of living. It would have been easy to give in to despair, to accept that he was flawed, broken, unworthy of the task before him. But Cormac understood what the test was really asking. "I am all of these things," he said, when the visions finally faded. "I am weak and afraid and uncertain, but I am also strong. I am also brave. I am also determined." He rose to his feet, though his legs trembled. "I do not claim to be perfect. I claim only to try, to give everything I have in service of something greater than myself." Tew regarded him in silence for a long moment. Then the god nodded, and something like approval flickered in those starry eyes. "You have courage, little druid, and wisdom to match. These are rare qualities in any age." He raised his remaining hand and touched Cormac's forehead. "Go with my blessing. Seek the grove, and when the darkness comes, remember that justice and courage will be your greatest weapons." Light flared, white and blinding. When Cormac's vision cleared, he was lying on his back in the center of the stone circle. The sky above was pink with dawn, and birdsong had returned to the world. The spirits were gone. The stone stood silent and still. He sat up slowly, every muscle in his body aching as if he had run for 100 miles. His head throbbed, his hands shook, but he was alive, and he was changed. He knew things now that he had not known before. The path to the grove was clear in his mind, a map drawn in light and shadow. And more than that, he understood the Germanic traditions in a way that mere study could never have taught him. Tew's touch had opened doors in his consciousness, showing him the connections between his own beliefs and those of the northern peoples. "Cormac!" a voice called from outside the circle. He turned to see Eorl standing at the edge of the clearing. The young warrior's face was pale, his eyes wide. "You survived," Eorl said, and there was wonder in his voice. "You survived the night." "I did." Cormac rose to his feet, using his staff for support. "And I am ready to continue my journey." Eorl crossed the boundary of the circle and approached him. For a long moment they stood face to face, warrior and druid, two men from different worlds. Then Eorl dropped to one knee. "I doubted you," he said. "I was wrong. Whatever you need for your quest, I will provide it. You have my sword and my loyalty." Cormac reached down and gripped Eorl's shoulder. "Rise," he said. "I need no one kneeling. What I need is a companion, someone who knows these lands and can help me reach the grove. Will you come with me?" Eorl looked up, his pale eyes shining. "I will," he said. "To whatever end." They walked out of the clearing together, druid and warrior, as the morning sun rose over the ancient forest. Behind them, the standing stones stood silent, keeping their eternal watch. The next stage of the journey was about to begin. The morning of their departure dawned grey and cold, with a mist that clung to the ground like a living thing. The village of Wolf's Haven stirred early to see them off. Wulfric himself came to the edge of the settlement, his weathered face unreadable as he clasped his son's arm in the warrior's farewell. "Return with honor," the chieftain said, his voice gruff, "and bring the druid back alive." He glanced at Cormac. "The spirits have accepted him. That is enough for me." Cormac bowed his head in respect. "I will guard your son as I would my own brother." Wulfric grunted, which might have been approval. Hilda waited at the forest edge, wrapped in a cloak of grey wool that made her look like a standing stone come to life. She pressed a small leather pouch into Cormac's hand. "Herbs for healing," she said, "and something more. A powder that, when thrown into fire, will create a flash of blinding light. Use it only in great need." "You are not coming with us?" Cormac asked, though he already suspected the answer. "My bones are too old for such a journey." Hilda smiled, the wrinkles of her face deepening. "But I will travel with you in spirit. When you reach the grove, call upon me. I will hear you even across the distance and lend what strength I can." She turned to Eol and spoke to him in their own tongue, words that made the young warrior's jaw tighten and his eyes grow bright with emotion. He embraced her briefly, fiercely, and then stepped back. "We should go," Eol said, his voice rough. "The forest does not grow shorter with waiting." They set out along a narrow path that wound northward through the trees. Cormac walked in the middle, with Owl leading and Sigrid, who had insisted on accompanying them for the first day's journey, bringing up the rear. She claimed she had trading business in a village along their route, but Cormac suspected she simply wanted to ensure they got safely past the most dangerous stretch of forest. The woods closed around them like a living curtain. The oaks here were ancient beyond measure, their trunks so thick that 10 men joining hands could not have circled them. Their branches wove together overhead, blocking out all but scattered fragments of sky. The light that filtered through was green and dim, like sunlight seen from beneath the surface of a pond. "The forest has many names," Yorl said as they walked, his voice low. "The villagers call it the Thornwood, for the brambles that grow thick in some places. The old ones called it the Waking Wood, because they believed the trees themselves were aware, watching all who pass beneath their branches." "And what do you call it?" Cormac asked. Eol was silent for a moment. "I call it home," he said finally. "I have hunted these paths since I was old enough to hold a bow. I know every stream, every clearing, every hollow, where deer take shelter in winter. But even I do not venture into the deepest parts. There are places where the light never reaches, places where things live that have no names." They walked in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. The forest was not quiet, not exactly. Birds called in the canopy above. Small creatures rustled in the undergrowth. But beneath those ordinary sounds, Cormac could sense something else, a kind of listening, a patient awareness that had nothing to do with animals or birds. The trees were indeed watching. Around midday, they stopped to rest beside a stream that bubbled over moss-covered stones. The water was clear and cold, and Cormac drank deeply, feeling it wash away some of the weariness that had settled into his bones. "We are being followed," Sigrid said quietly, crouching beside him. Cormac did not turn to look. "I know. I have felt them since we entered the forest." "Forest spirits?" Eorl said, joining them. "Wights. the old people called them. They are curious about strangers, but usually harmless if you show them respect. As if summoned by his words, a figure stepped out from behind a nearby oak. It was small, no taller than a child, but its proportions were wrong. Its limbs were too long, its fingers too slender, its face a collection of angles that did not quite add up to human. Its skin was the color and texture of bark, and its eyes gleamed like pools of amber in the dim light. "Travelers," the white said, its voice like wind through dry leaves. "You walk the old paths. Why?" Cormac rose slowly, keeping his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. "We seek the Grove of Council," he said, "the place where the gods once met." The white's amber eyes widened. It made a sound that might have been a laugh. "The dying place," it said. "The shadow's nest. You walk toward darkness, travelers. Why would any seek such a fate?" "Because the darkness must be stopped," Cormac replied, "or it will spread beyond the grove and consume everything." The white studied him for a long moment. More figures emerged from the trees, a dozen or more, all similar to the first, but each subtly different. They gathered around the travelers in a loose circle, their bark-skin faces unreadable. "We remember the time before the shadow," one of the whites said. "We remember when the grove was bright with power, when the gods walked beneath its branches and the world was young. We remember the Alliance." "Then you know why we must reach it," Cormac said. The whites conferred among themselves in a language of rustling and creaking like trees bending in a storm. Finally, the first one spoke again. "We will guide you," it said, "through the safe paths past the places where the shadow has already touched, but we cannot enter the grove itself. The darkness there is poison to our kind." "We accept your guidance with gratitude," Cormac said, bowing his head. The whites led them deeper into the forest, a long path that no human eye could have found. They moved through thickets that parted at their approach and closed again behind. They crossed streams on bridges of living roots that seemed to grow into place just as they needed them. As they traveled, the whites spoke of the forest and its history. They told of the first peoples who had raised the standing stones, of the druids and volvers who attended the sacred places, of the slow fading of magic as humans turned to other beliefs. Their voices were sad, but not bitter, carrying the acceptance of beings who had seen empires rise and fall like seasons. The shadow came slowly, one white explained as they walked. "At first it was just a forgetting. People stopped leaving offerings at the old shrines. They stopped telling the stories. The names of the gods faded from their lips. And as they forgot, the shadow grew. It fed on the emptiness left behind." "What is it?" Cormac asked. "The shadow. What is its nature?" The white was silent for a long moment. "It is what remains when belief dies," it said finally. "The absence where faith once lived. It is not evil in the way a wolf or a storm is evil. It simply is. But its hunger is endless, and it will consume all the old ways if it is not stopped." Night began to fall, and the whites led them to a clearing where they could make camp. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and the trees around them seemed to lean inward, offering protection from the wind. "We will watch through the night," the lead white said. "Sleep safely. Tomorrow you will reach the edge of our domain, and you must walk the final stretch alone." Cormac thanked them and set about making a small fire. The flames caught quickly, and soon the clearing was filled with warm, flickering light. Sigrid had brought supplies from the village, and they shared a meal of dried meat, hard cheese, and bread that was only slightly stale. "I leave you in the morning," Sigrid said as they ate. "My path turns east toward the trading post." She looked at Cormac with something like fondness. "You are strange, druid, but I think the world needs more strange people like you." "May your trades be profitable," Cormac replied. Sigrid laughed. "May your gods be with you, all of them, Celtic and Germanic alike." After the meal, you all took first watch while Cormac tried to sleep. But sleep was slow in coming. His mind kept returning to the vision Tew had shown him, the weight of the task ahead. He lay on his back, staring up through the branches at the stars that gleamed like scattered jewels. He must have dozed eventually, because when he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the clearing. He stood in a place of golden light, a meadow of grass that rippled like water in a breeze that carried the scent of summer. The sky above was the deep blue of a perfect afternoon, and in the distance he could see mountains capped with snow. A figure approached across the meadow, tall and proud, with hair like spun sunlight and eyes that held the brightness of flame. He wore a cloak that shifted through every color of the rainbow, and in his hand he carried a spear that gleamed with inner light. Cormac knew him at once, not from the Germanic tales that Thorvald and Hilda had shared, but from his own traditions. "Lugh," Cormac breathed. "Lugh's of the long arm, master of all arts." The god smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise. "You remember," Lugh said. "That is good. Too many of our children have forgotten." Cormac dropped to one knee. "Lord, I am honored beyond words." "Rise, Cormac of Innis Derwit." Lugh's voice was warm, like honey mead on a cold night. "I have not come to receive worship. I have come to offer guidance." He gestured, and the meadow around them shifted. Suddenly they stood at the edge of a great forest, looking toward a distant grove where trees towered against the sky. But the grove was dark, wrapped in shadow that pulsed and writhed like a living thing. "The Grove of Council," Luke said, "where once I met with Woden and Thunor and the other powers of the north, where we forged the alliance that protected both our peoples for 1,000 years. He paused, his bright eyes growing sad. "It dies, Cormac. With every passing day the shadow grows stronger, and our light grows dimmer." "What can I do?" Cormac asked. "I am only one druid. How can I stand against a darkness that even the gods struggled to contain?" Lugh turned to face him, and his expression was fierce. "You are not alone," he said. "You carry the blessing of Tew. You have the friendship of the forest spirits. And when you reach the grove, others will come to your aid." He placed a hand on Cormac's shoulder, and warmth flooded through the druid's body. "But there is something you must understand. The shadow is not defeated by strength alone. It is defeated by memory, by belief, by the telling of stories, and the keeping of traditions. That is the weapon you must wield." "How?" Cormac pressed. When you reach the grove, Lug said, you must perform the ritual of remembrance. Call upon the old gods, Celtic and Germanic alike. Speak their names, tell their stories, remind the world of what has been forgotten, and in doing so you will kindle a light that even the shadow cannot extinguish. The vision began to fade, the golden meadow dissolving into mist. Wait, Cormac called. I have so many questions. Lug's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Trust in yourself, son of the oak. Trust in your companions. And trust in the power of memory. The old ways are not dead. They only sleep. And you have the power to wake them. Cormac opened his eyes to find himself back in the clearing. The fire burned down to embers, and the first grey light of dawn creeping through the branches. Jarl sat nearby, watching him with concern. You were speaking in your sleep, the warrior said, in a language I did not recognize. I was given a vision, Cormac replied, sitting up slowly. By one of my gods. He showed me what must be done. He shared what Lugh had told him, and Jarl listened in silence. When Cormac finished, the warrior nodded slowly. A ritual of remembrance, Jarl repeated, speaking the names and telling the stories. He paused, a strange expression crossing his face. My grandmother used to do something similar. On the longest night of winter, she would gather the children and tell us tales of the gods. She said it was important to remember, even when others thought such things foolish. It is more important than anyone knew, Cormac said. Come, we have far to go. They broke camp quickly. Sigrid embraced them both before departing on her own path, and the whites reappeared to guide them through the final stretch of their domain. By mid-morning, they had reached the boundary of the Thornwood, where the forest gave way to open moorland dotted with twisted trees and standing stones. Beyond this, we cannot follow, the lead white said, but the grove lies one day's journey to the north. You will know it by the great trees that surround it, oaks and ashes older than memory. He paused. Be wary, travelers. The shadow knows you are coming. It will try to stop you before you reach your goal. Cormac thanked the whites for their guidance and their wisdom. Then he and Jarl set out across the moorland, two small figures beneath an endless grey sky, walking toward a darkness that waited with endless patience. The final stage of their journey had begun. The moorland stretched before them like a sea of brown and grey, broken only by occasional outcroppings of stone and the skeletal shapes of wind-twisted trees. The sky hung low and heavy, threatening rain that never quite came. A cold wind blew constantly from the north, carrying scents of peat and distant snow. They walked in silence for most of the morning, each lost in thought. The ground was uneven, tussocks of grass hiding pools of dark water that would swallow a foot to the ankle if one stepped carelessly. Cormac learned quickly to follow in Jarl's footsteps, trusting the warrior's knowledge of such terrain. Around midday, Jarl raised a hand and stopped. There, he said, pointing toward a low rise in the distance. Do you see it? Cormac squinted against the grey light. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then his eyes adjusted and he made out shapes on the hilltop. Mounds of earth, too regular to be natural, arranged in a pattern that spoke of deliberate design. A burial ground, Cormac said. Jarl nodded. one of the old places. My people have avoided this spot for generations. They say the dead here do not sleep easily. But Cormac was already walking toward the mounds. Something pulled at him, a sense of recognition that went beyond mere curiosity. His staff grew warm in his hand, pulsing with a rhythm like a heartbeat. "Wait," Yorl called, hurrying to catch up. "You cannot simply walk into a place of the dead. There are rituals, protocols." "I know," Cormac replied without slowing. "But the dead are calling to me. They have something to show us." The burial mounds grew larger as they approached, revealing themselves to be substantial structures. The largest stood at the center of the complex, a great dome of earth, perhaps 50 paces across, and twice the height of a man. Around it, smaller mounds clustered like children around a mother, each marked with standing stones carved with symbols that seemed to belong to no single tradition. Cormac stopped at the edge of the complex and studied the carvings. He recognized some of them: Celtic spirals and knotwork, the triple spiral that represented the eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth. But mixed among these were Germanic runes, angular shapes that Hilda had begun to teach him. And beneath both, older symbols still, the marks of the forgotten people who had raised the standing stones. "This is a shared place," Cormac said softly. "Both our peoples buried their dead here, together." Yorl had come to stand beside him, his face pale but his jaw set with determination. "The stories speak of such places," the warrior said, "from the time of the Alliance, but I thought they were only legends. All legends have roots in truth." Cormac approached the great central mound. Its entrance was a dark opening framed by massive stones, leading down into the earth. Cold air flowed from within, carrying scents of age and dust and something else, something that made the hair rise on the back of his neck. "Stay close," Cormac told Eorl, "and be respectful. We are guests in the house of the dead." They descended into darkness. The passage was narrow at first, forcing them to duck their heads and turn sideways to squeeze between the ancient stones. But after a few paces, it opened into a wider corridor, and Cormac called upon his power to create a soft light that emanated from the head of his staff. The walls of the passage were covered with carvings and paintings, warriors in battle, gods in their glory, scenes of hunting and feasting and worship. The artwork was faded with age, but still vivid enough to take Cormac's breath away. "Look," Yorl whispered, pointing at one panel. The image showed two groups of figures meeting in a forest clearing. On one side stood beings that were clearly Celtic, druids in robes carrying staffs, warriors with torques around their necks. On the other side were Germanic figures, wise women with runes painted on their faces, warriors bearing axes and hammers, and between them, towering over all, were the gods themselves. Cormac recognized Lugh among the Celtic deities, and what could only be Woden among the Germanic. The first meeting, Cormac said, the beginning of the alliance. They continued deeper into the mound, the passage twisting and turning, leading them through chambers filled with grave goods, bronze weapons green with age, pottery painted with intricate designs, jewelry of gold and silver and precious stones, and everywhere the bones of the dead arranged with care and respect. In one chamber, they found the remains of a man and woman laid side by side. The man wore a Celtic torque around his neck. The woman was dressed in Germanic style, with runes embroidered on her burial shroud. They were married, Cormac realized, a union across peoples, a symbol of the alliance. Eorl knelt beside the graves, his expression reverent. "Sleep well, ancestors," he murmured. "We honor your memory." Something stirred in the air of the chamber, a presence ancient and vast that seemed to fill every corner of the space. Cormac felt the temperature drop sharply and his breath misted before his face. Then the spirits appeared. They rose from the graves like mist rising from a lake at dawn. Dozens of them, hundreds, filling the chamber with their pale, translucent forms. Celtic and Germanic dead, standing together as they had been buried together, their eyes fixed upon the living intruders. Cormac stood his ground, though every instinct screamed at him to flee. "We come in peace," he said, his voice steady. "We are servants of the old ways, seeking to restore what has been lost." One spirit stepped forward from the host. He was tall and proud, wearing the regalia of a chieftain, and though his form was faint and wavering, his presence commanded attention. "I am Brennan of the Western Hills," the spirit said, his voice like wind through empty halls. "In life, I was a druid like you. I came to these lands as an emissary of my people and found love among the Germanic folk." He gestured to the woman beside him, who smiled with a gentleness that transcended death. "My wife, Sigrun. We worked together to build the alliance to bring our peoples closer. And when we died, we were buried here, in the place between worlds." "We seek the Grove of Council," Cormac said. "We mean to restore the alliance and drive back the darkness." Brennan's spectral face grew grave. "The darkness. We have felt it growing, even here in the halls of the dead. It reaches into our realm, stealing memories, erasing the bonds that hold us together." He paused, his form flickering. "Some of our number have already faded. Forgotten by the living, they had nothing to anchor them, and the shadow consumed them." "Then there is no time to waste," Cormac said. "How do we reach the grove?" "The way is through this mound," Sigrun spoke, her voice softer than her husband's, but no less powerful. "Long ago, we built a passage that connects this place to the grove itself, a path through the realm of the dead, shorter than any road in the world of the living. But the way is guarded," Brennan added. "One of our number was given the task of protecting the passage. He does not rest easy. Time and isolation have twisted him into something dangerous." "A Draugr," Eorl breathed. "An undead guardian." Brennan nodded. "Ketil was his name, in life. A warrior of great renown. But death changed him as it changes all things. He may not recognize you as friends. He may see only intruders to be destroyed." Cormac gripped his staff tighter. "We will face this Ketil," he said. "If there is any way to reason with him, we will try. If not..." He left the thought unfinished. The spirits parted, revealing a passage at the far end of the chamber. It descended deeper into the earth, into a darkness that even Cormac's magical light seemed unable to penetrate. "Before you go," Sigrun said, "take our blessing." She moved forward and pressed her translucent hand against Cormac's forehead. A shock of cold passed through him, followed by warmth that spread to every corner of his body. Beside him, Brennan did the same to Eorl. "The memories of the Alliance live within us," Brennan said. "Now they live within you as well. May they guide you in the darkness ahead." The spirits began to fade, sinking back into their graves, returning to their eternal rest. But their presence lingered, a warmth in Cormac's chest that felt like hope. He turned to Eorl. "Are you ready?" The warrior drew his sword, the blade ringing as it left the scabbard. "Lead on, druid." The descent took them deeper than Cormac had thought possible, down stairs carved from living rock, through passages that dripped with moisture and echoed with their footsteps. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker, until even the light from Cormac's staff seemed to struggle. Then the passage opened into a great chamber, and they found themselves face to face with the Guardian. Kettil had been a massive man in life. In death he was something else entirely. His body was preserved but wrong, the flesh grey and leathery, the eyes burning with cold blue fire. He wore armor that had rusted and fused with his skin, and he carried an axe whose blade was black with old blood. He stood at the far end of the chamber, before a doorway that pulsed with faint light, and when he saw them he roared. The sound was like nothing Cormac had ever heard. It was rage and grief and endless isolation, compressed into a single terrible cry. The Draugr charged, moving with a speed that belied his massive frame, the black axe sweeping in a deadly arc. Eorl met him blade to blade. The clash of weapons rang through the chamber like thunder. Eorl was quick and skilled, his sword dancing in patterns that would have ended any mortal opponent. But Kettil was not mortal. He felt no pain, knew no fatigue. Every wound Eorl inflicted closed within seconds, the grey flesh knitting itself back together with horrible speed. "Cormac!" Eorl shouted, barely dodging a blow that would have taken his head. "I cannot hold him forever." Cormac raised his staff and spoke words of power, hurling golden light at the Draugr. Kettil staggered but did not fall. The light seemed to cause him pain, but not enough to stop him. Then Cormac remembered what Brennan and Sigrun had given him. "Kettil," he called, his voice carrying through the chamber with supernatural clarity. "Kettil of the Northern Shore, sword brother of Brennan, oath keeper of the Alliance." The Draugr hesitated, the blue fire in his eyes flickering. "I know who you were," Cormac continued, stepping closer despite every instinct screaming at him to run. "You were a warrior who swore to protect the passage between worlds. You gave your death in service of the Alliance, and you have kept that oath for 1,000 years. Kettil lowered his axe slightly. The rage in his eyes was giving way to something else. Confusion. And beneath that, a terrible aching loneliness. "The Alliance," the Draugr said, his voice like stones grinding together. I remember the oath. "The Alliance is threatened," Cormac said. "The darkness comes to consume everything our peoples built together. We are going to the grove to stop it. Will you let us pass?" For a long moment, Kettil was silent. Then slowly, he stepped aside. "Go," he said. "Fulfill your purpose, and when the darkness is defeated—" He paused, and something almost like hope flickered in those burning eyes. "Remember me. Speak my name, so that I may finally rest." Cormac bowed deeply. "Kettil of the Northern Shore," he said, "your name will be remembered. I swear it on the staff of the Dagda and the honor of my order." The Draugr nodded once. Then he turned and walked back to his position before the doorway, resuming his eternal vigil. Owl sheathed his sword with shaking hands. "That was either the bravest thing I have ever seen," he said, "or the most foolish." "Perhaps both," Cormac replied. "Come, the grove awaits." They passed through the doorway, leaving Kettle behind. The passage beyond was short, leading upward through a tunnel of roots and earth, and at the end they emerged into open air, into the heart of a forest that Cormac knew at once was their destination. Great trees surrounded them, oaks and ashes of impossible size, their branches reaching toward a sky that swirled with unnatural clouds, and ahead, through the twisted trunks, they could see a clearing where an ancient altar of grey stone stood waiting, the Grove of Council. They had arrived, but even as relief flooded through Cormac, he felt the darkness presses in from all sides. The shadow was here, all around them, and it knew they had come. The final battle was about to begin. The Grove of Council was dying. Cormac could see it in every withered branch, every blackened leaf, every patch of rot that spread across the forest floor like a plague. The great trees that had once stood proud and green now sagged under the weight of their own decay. Their bark was grey and peeling. Their roots, visible above the ground, were twisted and gnarled like the fingers of old men. The air itself tasted wrong, flat and stale, as if the very essence of life had been drained away. And at the center of it all stood the altar. It was a massive slab of grey stone, taller than a man and wider than the span of his arms. Symbols covered every surface, Celtic spirals and Germanic runes intertwined in patterns that had been ancient when the first humans walked these lands. Once, those symbols had glowed with power. Now they were dull and faded, barely visible beneath layers of grime and creeping shadow. "By the gods," Yorl breathed, "what has happened to this place?" "Forgetfulness," Cormac replied. His voice was heavy with sorrow. "The shadow feeds on forgotten things, and this place, this sacred meeting ground of our peoples, has been forgotten for too long." They approached the altar slowly, picking their way through the detritus of decay. The ground squelched beneath their feet, releasing smells of rot and stagnant water. Small things moved in the underbrush, creatures that were not quite animals, their forms wrong and twisted by the darkness that had seeped into everything. "The shadow knows we are here," Cormac said. "It will not let us work unopposed." As if in answer, the darkness around them seemed to thicken. The grey light filtering through the canopy grew dimmer. Sounds became muffled, as if the world itself was being wrapped in a smothering blanket. "What do we do?" Yorl asked. His sword was in his hand, though there was nothing yet to fight. "We prepare." Cormac moved to the altar and began clearing away the accumulated filth. His hands grew black with grime, but beneath the dirt the symbols still remained. "We must perform the ritual of remembrance. Call upon the old gods, speak their names, tell their stories, rekindle the light of memory." Eol sheathed his sword and joined him in the work. Together, they scrubbed the altar clean, using water from their skins and cloths torn from their own garments. It was slow, painstaking labor, but gradually the symbols emerged from beneath the layers of neglect. "I recognize some of these," Yorl said, tracing a rune with his finger. This is the mark of Woden, and here Thuna's hammer, and these are ours. Cormac pointed to the spirals and knots that wove between the runes, the triple spiral of eternal return, the tree of life, the symbols of the Dagda and the Morrigan and Lug of the long arm. They worked in silence for a time, the only sounds their breathing and the soft scrape of cloth against stone. The darkness pressed closer, but did not yet attack. It was waiting, Cormac sensed, gathering its strength. When the altar was as clean as they could make it, Cormac stood back and surveyed their work. The symbols seemed brighter now, as if the simple act of uncovering them had returned some small measure of their power. Now, Cormac said, we gather what we need for the ritual. He moved through the grove, searching for specific items. Despite the decay, some things survived. He found mistletoe growing on one of the great oaks, its white berries gleaming like pearls in the dim light. He gathered fallen branches of ash and rowan. He collected stones from a dried stream bed rounded by centuries of water. Eeyore watched with interest as Cormac arranged these items around the altar. "What are you making?" "A sacred space," Cormac replied. "A framework for the ritual. Each element represents one of the old powers. The oak for strength and wisdom, the ash for the connection between worlds, the rowan for protection, the mistletoe for the boundary between life and death, and the stones, the foundation, that which endures when all else passes." Cormac placed the last stone and stepped back. There, the framework is complete. The grove had grown darker still. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches creaking ominously. And in the shadows beyond the clearing, shapes were beginning to move. "They come," Yol said, drawing his sword once more. "Hold them off as long as you can," Cormac told him. "I must begin the ritual." He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, centering himself. The training of a lifetime flowed through him, all the lessons Brenius had taught, all the wisdom of his order. He raised his staff and began to speak. The words came in the old tongue, the language of the druids that had been passed down for generations beyond counting. He spoke of the beginning, when the world was young, and the gods walked openly among mortals. He spoke of the first alliance, when Celtic and Germanic powers had recognized their kinship and joined their strength. He named the gods one by one, giving voice to their stories, their deeds, their sacrifices. The Dagda, he intoned, father of all, keeper of the cauldron of plenty, he who carries the club of life and death, who can destroy an army with one end and restore them with the other. The symbols on the altar flickered. The Morrigan, queen of phantoms, goddess of war and fate. She who flies over battlefields as a crow, who washes the armor of those doomed to die. A distant cry echoed through the grove, a harsh cawing that might have been a crow. Lu, of the long arm, master of all arts and crafts. He whose spear never misses, whose sling stone brought down the giant Baler. Golden light began to seep from the Celtic symbols, faint but growing. Behind him, Cormac heard Eorl shout a challenge. The clash of steel against something harder than steel. The warrior was fighting, holding the line against whatever horrors the darkness had sent. Cormac did not turn. He could not break his concentration now. Woden, he continued, switching to the Germanic names. All-Father of the North, he who sacrificed his eye for wisdom, who hung upon the world tree for 9 days and nights to gain the secret of the runes. The runes on the altar began to glow, blue and silver, answering the golden light of the Celtic symbols. Thuna, the Thunderer, protector of mankind, he who wields the hammer of lightning, who battles the giants to keep the world safe. Thunder rumbled in the distance, though there was no storm. Tiwayu, the one-handed god of justice and courage, he who sacrificed his sword hand to bind the wolf Fenrir, who keeps his oaths even unto death. The light from the altar was growing stronger now, pushing back the darkness that pressed in from all sides. Cormac felt power flowing through him, channeling through the staff of the Dagda, feeding into the ritual, but it was not enough. He could feel the shadow resisting, pushing back against the light. The darkness was too strong, too deeply rooted. He needed more. "Hilda," he called out, remembering the wise woman's promise. "Hilda of Wolf's Haven, I call upon you. Lend me your strength." For a moment, nothing happened. Then from far away, he felt an answering presence. Hilda's voice whispered in his mind, words of power in the Germanic tongue that wove together with his Celtic chanting, creating something greater than either alone. The light from the altar surged upward, a pillar of gold and silver that pierced the dark canopy overhead. Behind him, all was still fighting. Cormac could hear the warrior's ragged breathing, his grunts of effort, the sounds of blade meeting shadow flesh. He could not hold forever. Cormac reached for more. He called upon the spirits of the standing stones, the wights of the forest, the ancestors in their burial mound. He called upon every power he could name, every god and spirit who had ever been worshipped by either people, and they answered. Light exploded from the altar, not just gold and silver now, but every color imaginable, a rainbow of divine power that swept through the grove like a cleansing fire. The darkness recoiled, shrieking in a voice that was not a voice, a sound of emptiness and hunger and rage. But still it did not flee. Still it pressed against the light, seeking weaknesses, probing for ways through. Cormac felt his strength beginning to fail. The ritual was working, but it was not complete. Something was missing, some essential element without which the darkness could not be fully driven back. Then he understood. Sacrifice, he gasped. The gods had always demanded sacrifice. The Dagda had given freely of his cauldron. Woden had given his eye. Tew had given his hand. Power required payment. Light required fuel, and Cormac knew what he had to give. He reached into his robes and drew out the leather pouch that hung around his neck, the pouch containing Brennius's ashes, the last physical connection to his homeland, to his mentor, to everything he had been before this journey began. "Master," he whispered, "forgive me." He opened the pouch and let the ashes fall onto the altar. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Light blazed from the altar with the intensity of a newborn sun. The symbols carved into the stone burst into brilliant illumination, Celtic and Germanic patterns merging into something new, something that was both and neither. The very air seemed to catch fire, not with heat but with power, with the accumulated weight of generations of belief. and memory and faith. The darkness screamed. It was a sound that went beyond sound, a cry of absolute anguish that shook the grove to its foundations. The shadow creatures that had been attacking Eorl dissolved into nothing. The creeping rot that had covered the ground withered and blew away. The twisted forms in the underbrush simply ceased to exist. And then, at the heart of the darkness, something took shape. It was vast and terrible, a figure made of absence, of the void left behind when things are forgotten. It had no face, no form that the mind could properly grasp, but Cormac knew what he was looking at. Forgetfulness itself, the shadow given shape. "You can't destroy me," the figure said, its voice the whisper of erased memories. "I am eternal. As long as mortals forget, I will endure. You may drive me back today, but I will return. I always return." Cormac faced the creature without flinching. "You are right," he said. "We cannot destroy you, but we can remember. We can tell the stories. We can keep the old ways alive. And as long as we do, you will never triumph." The figure seemed to consider this. Then without another word it began to retreat. The darkness pulled back from the grove like a tide receding from the shore. The twisted clouds overhead parted, revealing a sky that was clear and bright. Sunlight, real sunlight, streamed down into the clearing for the first time in what might have been centuries. Cormac fell to his knees, utterly spent. Eorl was beside him in an instant, supporting him with strong arms. "Is it over?" the warrior asked. "For now," Cormac replied. "The shadow retreats, but it spoke truth. It will return. It always returns." He looked at the altar, which still glowed faintly with residual power. The symbols carved into its surface were clear and sharp now, Celtic and Germanic patterns intertwined as they had been meant to be. "Our task is not to defeat it forever," Cormac said softly. "Our task is to remember, to tell the stories, to keep the light burning." All nodded slowly. "Then that is what we will do." Around them, the grove began to heal. The great trees straightened, their bark losing its grey pallor, their leaves uncurling and turning green. Flowers bloomed in the undergrowth. Birds began to sing in the branches overhead. The grove of council was alive again. And in the distance, barely visible against the brightening sky, the forms of gods could be seen, Celtic and Germanic, standing together as they had in the age of legends, watching over the world they had helped create. Cormac raised his staff in salute. "The alliance endures," he said, and somewhere in a realm beyond mortal understanding, the gods smiled. The peace that followed the shadow's retreat was brief. Cormac had barely risen to his feet, still leaning heavily on his staff, when the air around them began to change. The brightness that had flooded the grove dimmed, not with returning darkness, but with something else entirely. A pressure, vast and ancient, building like a storm about to break. "Something is coming," Eorl said, his hand going to his sword. "No," Cormac replied, his voice hushed with wonder. "Someone." The altar at the center of the grove began to pulse with light. The intertwined symbols, Celtic and Germanic, blazed with colors that had no names in mortal tongues. The great trees swayed though there was no wind, their branches reaching toward the sky in attitudes of worship. And then the gods arrived. They came as light at first, pillars of brilliance descending from the heavens, touching down around the altar like beams of pure divinity. Then the light took form, solidified, became figures of terrible beauty and overwhelming power. Cormac fell to his knees. Beside him, Yorl did the same. The first to fully manifest was a figure Cormac knew from 1,000 carvings and 100 dreams. The Dagda stood before them, vast and mighty, his great club resting against one shoulder and his cauldron at his feet. His face was kind but fierce, the face of a father who loved his children but would destroy anything that threatened them. Beside the Dagda stood a woman wrapped in shadow and starlight. 3 faces she had, maiden and mother and crone, shifting between them with each heartbeat. Crows circled above her head, their caws filling the air with the sounds of prophecy. The Morrigan had come, and there was Lugh, golden and glorious, his spear blazing with the light of the sun itself. He smiled at Cormac, and in that smile was recognition, acknowledgement, pride. From the Germanic side of the altar, other figures took shape. Woden the Allfather, his single eye gleaming with the wisdom of ages, 2 ravens perched upon his shoulders, whispering secrets only he could hear. His cloak was the color of storms, and his spear Gungnir hummed with barely contained power. Thuna stood beside his father, broad and powerful, his red beard crackling with lightning. The hammer at his belt seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, eager for battle, hungry for the defense of those under its protection. And there was Freya, beautiful beyond mortal comprehension, her cloak of falcon feathers rippling in an unseen wind. Tears of gold fell from her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the sheer intensity of her presence in the mortal world. More gods appeared, Celtic and Germanic, filling the grove with their radiance. Brigid with her flame of inspiration, Cernunnos with his crown of antlers, Tew with his missing hand held high in greeting, Frigg with her spindle of fate. So many names, so many stories, so many powers that had shaped the world since its beginning. Cormac could not breathe. The weight of so much divinity pressed down upon him, not cruelly, but simply by its nature. Mortals were not meant to stand in the presence of gods. The soul knew its place in the great ordering of things. Rise, child of the oak. The Dagda's voice rolled through the grove like thunder, like the beating of a great drum, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. You have done well. You have rekindled the flame that was dying. You have reminded us of what we are and what we were meant to be. Cormac struggled to his feet, using his staff for support. Yorl remained on his knees, overwhelmed by the glory before him. My lords, Cormac managed, my ladies, we are honored beyond measure. The honor is ours, Luke said, stepping forward. You have crossed sea and forest, faced spirits and guardians, sacrificed what was precious to you, and in doing so, you have given us a gift we could not give ourselves. What gift is that? Cormac asked. Memory, the Morrigan answered, her 3 voices speaking in harmony. We are beings of belief. We exist because mortals remember us, tell our stories, speak our names. When they forget, we fade. When they remember, we grow strong." She gestured to the assembled gods. "Look at us now. Look at our power. This is what memory can do." Cormac looked, and he saw what she meant. The gods blazed with light, their forms solid and defined, their power palpable. This was not the faded glory of neglected deities. This was divine might in its fullness, awakened by the ritual of remembrance. "But the shadow spoke truth," Woden said, his single eye fixing upon Cormac with terrible intensity. "It cannot be destroyed. As long as mortals have the capacity to forget, the shadow will endure. It will retreat for a time, lick its wounds, gather its strength, and then it will return. Then what hope is there?" Yoel spoke for the first time, his voice rough with emotion. Woden smiled, and it was a smile of ancient cunning. "Hope lies in what you have begun today. The alliance has been renewed. Celtic and Germanic, two traditions that were always one beneath their different masks." He turned to address all the assembled gods. "We must work together as we did in the days of old. We must ensure that our stories are told, our names spoken, our ways remembered." The Dagda nodded his great head. "The druids will teach again. The vulvas will speak prophecy. The sacred places will be tended." He looked at Cormac. "And you, young one, will be our bridge. You have learned both traditions. You carry both within you. You will teach others to do the same." Before Cormac could respond, the air around them grew cold once more. The shadow had returned. It rose from the edges of the grove, a tide of darkness that had not truly retreated, but only gathered itself for a final assault. It knew that the gods were present, that their power was at its height, and it had chosen to strike now, while all the targets were in one place. Shadow creatures emerged from the darkness by the hundreds, by the thousands. They were shapes of nightmare given form, things that fed on fear and doubt and the death of memory. They swarmed toward the altar, toward the gods, toward the two mortals who stood at the center of it all. But the gods were ready. Thuna moved first, his hammer leaping into his hand with a crack of thunder that shook the grove to its roots. He hurled it into the mass of shadow creatures, and where it struck, they simply ceased to exist. The hammer flew back to his hand, and he threw it again and again, a relentless barrage of divine destruction. The Morrigan took to the air, transforming into a great crow of shadow and starlight. She dove into the enemy ranks, her talons tearing through darkness like knives through cloth. Her cries echoed across the battlefield, filling the shadow creatures with terror, making them hesitate and falter. Lug's spear flew faster than sight, striking a dozen targets with each throw, and returning to his hand between heartbeats. Golden light blazed in his wake, burning away the darkness wherever it fell. The Dagda waded into battle like a force of nature, his club sweeping through the enemy ranks with devastating effect. With one end, he crushed shadow creatures into nothingness. With the other, he healed the wounded earth, restoring life to ground that the darkness had poisoned. Woden stood at the center of the altar, his spear Gungnir raised high. He did not throw it, did not need to. Instead, he spoke words of power, runes of binding and banishment that carved themselves into the air in letters of fire. Where those runes touched the shadow, it burned. Freya fought with a fury that belied her beauty, her falcon cloak allowing her to soar above the battle, striking down at enemies with magic that turned them to dust. Her tears of gold fell upon the grove, and wherever they landed, flowers bloomed and light returned. And through it all, the other gods fought as well. Brigid with her sacred flame, Cernunnos with the wild power of nature itself, Tiw with a sword that seemed to judge each enemy it struck, Frigg weaving protective magic around the mortals and the altar. Cormac and Jarl fought too, though their contributions were small beside the might of the gods. Jarl's sword cut through any shadow creature foolish enough to come close. Cormac's staff blazed with light, creating barriers of protection, hailing bolts of golden fire. But even with all their combined power, the shadow creatures kept coming. For every one that fell, two more seemed to rise from the darkness. The shadow itself was endless, a sea of forgetfulness that threatened to drown them all. Then Cormac understood. The shadow creatures were a distraction. While the gods fought, the true darkness was doing something else. Reaching, probing, searching for the heart of the grove's renewed power, the altar. Cormac turned just in time to see a tendril of pure darkness snake toward the sacred stone. It moved with purpose, with intelligence, seeking to corrupt the very thing that had driven it back. "No!" Cormac shouted. He threw himself between the tendril and the altar, raising his staff in both hands. The darkness struck the staff and recoiled, but only for a moment. Then it pressed forward again, seeking to overwhelm him through sheer force. Cormac felt the cold seeping into his bones, felt the darkness trying to erase him, to make him forget who he was and why he fought. Faces flashed before his eyes, growing dim. Brenius, his parents, the grove of his homeland, everything that made him who he was fading like morning mist. But then other memories rose to meet the darkness. Sigrid offering him passage on her ship. Thorvald sharing stories of the northern gods, Hilda teaching him the ways of the Volvas, all kneeling before him after the trial of the stones. The spirits in the burial mound sharing their blessings. Ketil the Draga stepping aside to let them pass. Celtic and Germanic, two peoples, one alliance, one purpose. Cormac opened his mouth and began to speak. Not a spell, not a prayer, but a story. The oldest story. The story of how the world began, of how the gods shaped the land and sea and sky. He spoke of the first alliance, of the meeting in the Grove of Council, of the oath sworn between powers that had seemed so different but were truly the same. His voice grew louder, stronger, carrying across the battlefield despite the chaos of combat. And as he spoke, others began to listen. The gods paused in their fighting, turning their attention to the mortal who stood against the darkness armed only with memory, and they joined their voices to his. The Dagda spoke of creation, of the shaping of the world. Woden spoke of sacrifice, of the price paid for wisdom. The Morrigans spoke of fate, of the threads that bound all things together. Lugh spoke of light, of the fire that burned in every mortal heart. Their voices merged, Celtic and Germanic, a chorus of divine power focused through the simple act of storytelling. And the darkness could not stand against it. The tendril that had been pressing against Cormac's staff withered and fell away. The shadow creatures across the battlefield dissolved into nothing. The great tide of darkness that had threatened to overwhelm them receded, pulling back, retreating from the light of remembered truth. At the heart of the shadow, the figure of forgetfulness appeared one final time. It was smaller now, diminished by the assault of memory. "This is not the end," it said, its voice a whisper of erased names. "I will return. I always return." "And we will be waiting," Cormac replied. "We will remember. We will tell the stories. We will speak the names. And every time you return, we will drive you back again." The figure regarded him for a long moment. Then, without another word, it faded into nothing, retreating to whatever void spawned such things. The battle was over. Cormac's legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed to the ground before the altar. The staff slipped from his nerveless fingers. Darkness claimed him, but it was the gentle darkness of exhaustion, not the cold emptiness of the shadow. The last thing he heard before unconsciousness took him was the voice of the Dagda, rumbling with approval. "Well done, son of the oak. Well done indeed." Cormac dreamed. He walked through a land of golden light, where the grass was green and soft beneath his feet, and the sky was the blue of perfect summer days. Rolling hills stretched to every horizon, dotted with groves of oak and ash and rowan. Streams sparkled in the sunlight, their waters clear and sweet. "This is the other world," a voice said beside him. Cormac turned to find Brenius walking at his side. Not the old dying Brenius of his final days, but a younger version, strong and vital, his eyes bright with wisdom and humor. "Master," Cormac breathed, "but you are dead. Death is a doorway, not an ending. You know this." Brenius smiled, the expression crinkling the corners of his eyes. "I have been watching you, boy, from this realm and others. I have seen everything you accomplished. I used your ashes." Cormac's voice was thick with emotion. "In the ritual, I sacrificed the last piece of you." Brenius reached out and gripped Cormac's shoulder. "You sacrificed nothing," he said gently. "What was in that pouch was just ash, just physical remains. The true essence of who I was lives on in the stories you tell, in the lessons you carry, in the traditions you will pass to others." He gestured to the golden landscape around them. "That is what this place truly is, you know. Not a land of the dead, but a land of memory. Everything that is remembered exists here. Everything that is loved endures." Tears streamed down Cormac's face, but they were not tears of sorrow. "I miss you, Master, and I am proud of you, more proud than words can express." Brenius began to fade, becoming translucent against the golden light. "Now wake up, Cormac! Your work is not yet finished. The alliance is renewed, but it must be maintained. You are the bridge between worlds now. Use that gift wisely." "Wait," Cormac called. "Will I see you again?" Brenius's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "You see me every time you remember, Every time you tell the stories, every time you speak the old words and honor the old ways, I am always with you, boy. Always. Then Cormac opened his eyes to find himself lying on soft grass, staring up at a canopy of green leaves through which golden sunlight filtered like honey through lace. The grove of council had transformed. Where before there had been decay and darkness, now there was life abundant. The great trees stood tall and proud, their bark healthy, their branches heavy with leaves. Flowers bloomed in profusion across the forest floor, white and gold and blue and purple. Birds sang in the canopy above, their voices filling the air with melody, and the altar at the center of the grove gleamed in the sunlight, its symbols bright and clear. Celtic spirals and Germanic runes intertwined in perfect harmony. You are awake. Cormac turned his head to find Eorl sitting nearby, his back against one of the great oaks. The warrior looked exhausted but content, his sword across his knees, his eyes soft with wonder. "How long was I unconscious?" Cormac asked, sitting up slowly. 3 days, Eorl replied. "I was beginning to worry, but the gods said you would wake when you were ready, and they were right. The gods. They stayed for a time after the battle." Eorl's voice carried a note of awe. They walked among the trees, speaking with each other, renewing their own bonds, Celtic and Germanic, together again as they were in the old days. He shook his head. "I never truly believed the stories before. I thought them just tales for children and old women, but now you know." Cormac finished for him. "Now I know." Cormac rose to his feet, testing his strength. He was weak, but not dangerously so. The 3 days of rest had done their work. His staff lay nearby, and when he picked it up, he felt the familiar warmth of its power, perhaps stronger now than it had ever been. "What did the gods say before they left?" Cormac asked. Eorl stood as well, sheathing his sword. "Many things, but the most important was this. They said the alliance was renewed, but fragile. It must be tended like a fire, fed with memory and story and worship." He looked at Cormac. "They said you would know what to do." Cormac walked to the altar and placed his hand upon its surface. The stone was warm to the touch, thrumming with power that resonated with something deep in his soul. "I must stay," he said. "Here in the north, I must learn the Germanic ways fully, become a bridge between the traditions." He turned to face Eorl. "And I will need help." Eorl nodded without hesitation. "I pledged you my sword and my loyalty. That pledge holds. Whatever you need, I will provide. Then let us return to Wolf's Haven." Cormac smiled. "There's much to do." The journey back through the forest was different from the journey in. The whites came to greet them almost immediately, their bark faces wearing expressions of joy. "The grove lives," the lead white said. "We felt it from across the forest. The shadow has retreated. The old power flows again." "It does," Cormac confirmed, "but it must be maintained." "Will your people help us?" The whites conferred in their rustling language, then turned back with what might have been smiles. "We will tend the old places. We will guard the paths. We will remember as we have always remembered. You have done what the gods themselves could not do alone. You have given the world a chance." They guided Cormac and Jarl through the forest by paths that seemed shorter than before, as if the land itself was helping them along. By evening of the second day, they emerged from the trees to see the smoke of Wolf's Haven rising in the distance. The village was not the same. Cormac sensed it the moment they approached. Something had changed in the 3 weeks since he had first arrived. The people who greeted them at the edge of the settlement did so with warmth rather than suspicion. Children ran alongside them, asking questions in a mixture of Germanic and the few Celtic words they had picked up. Women waved from doorways. Men paused in their work to call out greetings. Hilda was waiting for them at the entrance to the great hall. "You succeeded." She said it as a statement, not a question. "We felt it here. 3 nights ago, the stars burned brighter than they have in generations. The old symbols on our shrines began to glow. And I dreamed." She touched Cormac's face with gentle fingers. "I dreamed of gods walking in a grove of golden light. The alliance is renewed," Cormac told her, "but our work is just beginning." Wulfric received them in his hall with honors reserved for heroes. A feast was prepared, the finest the village could offer. Cormac sat at the chieftain's right hand with Jarl across from him, and the tales of their journey were told and retold as the night wore on. But it was what came after the feast that mattered most. In the days that followed, Cormac began his true work. He sat with Hilda and shared the Celtic traditions, the stories and rituals and prayers that had been passed down through generations of druids. In return, she taught him more of the Germanic ways, the runes and the chants and the ceremonies that honored the northern gods. They found common ground in surprising places. The same herbs that Celtic healers used for fever were known to Germanic wise women by different names but identical purposes. The same patterns that Celtic metalworkers hammered into their jewelry appeared in Germanic designs, separated by hundreds of miles but connected by something deeper. And slowly, carefully, they began to weave the two traditions together. It was not easy. There were disagreements, arguments, moments when the differences seemed insurmountable, but always they returned to the central truth that Cormac had learned in the Grove of Council. The gods of both peoples were not enemies, but allies. The traditions were not competitors, but complements. What served one served both. Winter came to Wolf's Haven, bringing snow and ice and long dark nights. But in the great hall the fires burned bright, and the stories were told. Cormac stood before the gathered villagers on the longest night of the year, and spoke of the Dagda and Woden, of the Morrigan and Freya, of the ancient alliance and its renewal. The children listened with wide eyes. The elders nodded with recognition, and somewhere, Cormac knew, the gods themselves were listening too. Spring arrived with a suddenness that surprised him. One day, the world was white and frozen. The next, green shoots were pushing through the snow, and birds were returning to fill the air with song. On the first truly warm day, Cormac walked to the standing stones outside the village, the circle where he had faced his trial, where Tew had touched his forehead and changed him forever. He stood in the center and looked up at the clear blue sky. "I do not know if you can hear me," he said aloud, "but I want you to know that I understand now. The weight of what I have been given, the responsibility. He paused, searching for words. I will not fail you. I will tend the alliance. I will teach others to do the same. I will be the bridge you need me to be. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a crow descended from the sky and landed on one of the standing stones. It regarded Cormac with a bright eye that held more than animal intelligence. We hear you, the Morrigan's voice whispered in his mind, and we are pleased. The crow spread its wings and flew away, vanishing into the blue. Cormac smiled and walked back to the village. Years passed. Cormac grew older, his dark hair threading with grey, his face weathering like good leather left in the sun. He never returned to his homeland, but he did not forget it. The Celtic traditions lived in his heart, even as he became master of the Germanic ways as well. He trained students, young men and women, who came from villages across the land to learn the old ways. Some were Germanic, curious about the Celtic traditions he brought. Others were Celtic travelers who had heard of the druid who walked between worlds. He taught them all, demanding nothing but dedication and an open heart. Eol remained his closest friend, the warrior becoming his protector and eventually the chieftain of Wolf's Haven when old Wulfric passed into the halls of the ancestors. Together, they maintained the alliance not just between gods but between peoples. Trade flourished, marriages were made, children were born who knew both traditions as their birthright, and every year, on the longest night, Cormac travelled to the Grove of Council, sometimes alone, sometimes with students, sometimes with All or Hilda or others who had earned the right. They would gather around the altar and tell the stories, speak the names, remember the alliance that held back the darkness. The shadow never fully disappeared. Cormac felt it sometimes, lurking at the edges of the world, waiting for memory to fade and forgetfulness to take hold. But as long as the stories were told, as long as the names were spoken, as long as people remembered, the shadow could not triumph. On one such night, late in his life, Cormac sat alone by the altar. His joints ached with age, and his breath came shorter than it once had, but his eyes were still clear, and his mind was still sharp. A figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, tall and proud, with hair like spun sunlight and eyes that held the brightness of flame. "Lou," Cormac said, rising with difficulty, "it has been many years. Time moves differently for us." Lug crossed to stand beside the old druid. "For me, it has been only moments since we last spoke, but I see it has been a lifetime. For you, a good lifetime," Cormac replied. "Full of purpose, the best kind." Lo placed a hand on Cormac's shoulder. "You have done everything we hoped for and more. The alliance is stronger now than it has been in 1,000 years. Because of you. Because of all of us," Cormac corrected. "I was just the bridge." Locke smiled. "The most important part of any structure." They stood in silence for a moment, god and mortal, watching the stars wheel overhead. "My time grows short," Cormac said finally. "I can feel it. The thread is nearly spun out." Lug nodded. "It is the way of mortal things. But what you have built will outlast your body. The students you have trained will train others. The stories you have told will be told again, and the alliance will endure." "And when I die," Cormac asked, "what then?" "Then you will walk in the other world, where all remembered things dwell. Lug's smile widened. Your old master waits for you there, you know. He has been watching. He is very proud. Cormac felt tears prick his eyes, but he did not try to hide them. Then I have no regrets, he said. Good. Lug began to fade, his form becoming translucent against the starlight. Live your remaining days well, son of the oak, and know that when your time comes, you will be welcomed as a hero in the halls of the gods. He was gone. Cormac stood alone in the grove of council, surrounded by the rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. He looked at the altar, at the intertwined symbols that represented everything he had worked for, everything he had become. Then he smiled, picked up his staff, and began the long walk home. And that, my dear friends, is where we will end tonight's tale. The story of Cormac the Druid, who crossed the grey sea and walked the path between worlds, who faced the darkness of forgetfulness and kindled the light of memory, who became a bridge between peoples and helped renew an alliance as old as the gods themselves. Remember his story. Tell it to others, for in the telling we keep the old ways alive, and in keeping them alive, we hold back the darkness for another day. May the gods of all peoples watch over you. May the light of memory guide your path, and may you always find your way home. Until next time, be safe and sweet dreams.